really a response to the Puritan ethic that exists in America, and I guess that we share with England.
A response against the Puritan ethic?
Yes, yes. An attack on what I feel are the negative aspects of the anti-sexual and anti-play and pleasure aspects of our tradition.
Forgive me, but aren't you introducing a kind of sociological aspect to something which is perhaps refined striptease? Or is this unkind?
Well, it's unkind only because it is rather inaccurate.
London's Playboy Club was the embodiment of Hugh Hefner's fantasy, a celebration of sex and glamour. But in 1975, it was rocked by the brutal murder of a Playboy Bunny called Eve Stratford.
It was a murder which led to a lot of fairly lurid speculation, but Scotland Yard are much more interested in hard facts than speculation.
In 1979, Linda Farrow, a croupier in a West End casino, died in apparently similar circumstances. Some police were convinced the murderer was the same man. I've come to question the links between those killings.
So for me, these are very different victims and very different crime scenes.
But digging deeper, I would unearth other tragedies.
She got attacked very brutally over her head and then raped.
And as I hunted for a potential serial killer, I would stumble across a different offender whose crimes struck at the heart of public trust in policing. If there's one thing that's more terrifying than the idea of a predator, it's a predator in a policeman's uniform. By 2023, I'd already spent years looking into this story. One of the most promising leads I had was the name of a former Metropolitan Police officer. He had known Linda Farrow, the croupier murdered in 1979, and her husband, Paul. He had been ruled out as a suspect, but Linda's mother, Gladys, had given me his name and told me to speak to him.
He was an ex-policeman, ex-publican, ex-Arab minder.
I'm going to call him Policeman A. He now lived in the Far East. And by the way, I might be 20 minutes of bollocks where we talk about food, OK?
Yeah.
I think that's the...
Let me call him from my phone now.
Well, why don't I just call him from this and see if he picks up?
Yeah. All right.
Welcome to voicemail service. Please record your message.
God, this is so frustrating. I spent 4 hours calling repeatedly, going straight to voicemail, didn't get a dicky bird. Look, the thing is positive. He's going to speak to us. We just have to be really patient. Back in the 1970s, detectives had no knowledge of DNA. But today, evidence that was gathered decades ago can reveal the identity of a killer. I wanted to know if modern forensic science might hold the answer to Linda Farrow's murder. You worked on the Linda Farrow murder case, right, when the case was reviewed in the noughties?
Yeah, that's right. As I recall, I believe it was as a result of Lynn Farrow's, I think at the time, elderly mother. I certainly remember that there was quite a lot of weight given to Paul Farrow, Lynn Farrow's ex-husband, and obviously he was of significant interest to the original inquiry. But there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but nothing they could really sort of hang their hat on to arrest and charge him.
The original investigation ruled Paul Farrow out as a suspect in 1979. He was never charged with the murder of his estranged wife, Linda.
I think he subsequently did die in the intervening years, so obviously that was a line of inquiry that wasn't open to us. So I wanted to go and find the original exhibit. The primary exhibit in this case really would have been the knife. Because obviously let's remember that from the time of the murder in the late 70s to the time we got the case, there have been huge advancements in forensic science. So there would have been a possibility of finding perhaps some DNA on the knife. And unfortunately, we could never find the exhibits despite well, strenuous efforts to find them, which was very, very frustrating.
What should have happened to the exhibits?
I mean, that was before my time in the late 70s, but all the exhibits would be gathered, recorded, carefully sealed, taken to a storage facility, of which there were several. So what actually happened to them, I've really got no idea. It's a distinct possibility that they could well have been disposed of.
Kind of puts the kibosh on there ever being DNA evidence from the Linda Farrow case that might provide a link with the murder of Eve Stratford, the former Playboy Bunny. I mean, the kind of story ends there.
Yeah, it does, unfortunately. I mean, I do remember, and this was really through conversations from colleagues involved in the sort of Eve Stratford inquiry. I think there was some outstanding DNA in the Eve Stratford case. So I can't really comment on what sort of happened afterwards, but I do always remember thinking that I thought the links at best were sort of fairly thin.
Incredibly, key evidence from the Linda Farrow crime scene had been lost. There was no way of using DNA to determine whether her murder was linked to Eve's. But DNA that turned up from another source took the Eve Stratford case in an astonishing new direction. Hi, Martin. Marcel.
Hi. Hello, Marcel.
In 2006, former detective Martin Lee was given the job of looking at a number of cold cases. What is the murder review team?
Any murder that wasn't resolved within a stipulated time period would be reviewed by an independent eye. So I was allocated a number of those and did some reviews of some investigations, which is when I had the conversation with the nice chief inspector at Colindale. When I explained to him that we looked at old cases and were looking for new evidence, DNA, new forensics and so on, he kind of latched onto that and said, I remember a case of Lynn Whedon, who was murdered all those years ago. This was the 3rd of September, 1975. She was a 16-year-old girl at the time. She'd been out with friends towards the end of the school summer holidays and was on her way home. And she walked down the alleyway and was struck on the head with something hard, blunt instrument, as we all say. She was then thrown over the fencing around an electricity substation where she was sexually assaulted, raped, and left there. She was found the following morning. She was still alive at that point, but she was taken to hospital and sadly died about a week later without regaining consciousness. And he said, I've always thought that that should be reinvestigated. I was conscious of the fact that there were, at the time, a lot of forensic samples had been taken, sealed, securely stored. So away it went for DNA testing, and I got a phone call sometime later from a very, very excited member of the Forensic Science Service to say, you won't believe this, we've got a confirmed DNA hit.
I mean, underline that, 29 years after the crimes committed, you have a DNA match.
Yeah, but it's not an individual, it's matched another crime scene, which was Eve Stratford, who was a bunny girl who'd been murdered 6 months earlier in March 75 in East London. I just couldn't comprehend that the two were the same because they were so dissimilar.
So in your mind, the only person who was at both crime scenes was the murderer?
Was the murderer, yeah. But what we were then conscious of was if we had Lynn Whedon in West London in September, Eve Stratford in East London the previous March, how many others were there? But we would never know that because way back in the 70s, DNA wasn't taken from anybody. So we started talking about the potential for other unsolved murders to have been committed by the same person.
The DNA link between the murders of Eve Stratford and Lynn Whedon was absolutely baffling. The two victims seemed to inhabit different worlds. Eve was an aspiring model who rubbed shoulders with celebrities. Lynn Whedon was a 16-year-old schoolgirl who had gone out with friends to a pub in the suburbs one Wednesday evening in 1975 and never come home. Tell me what we're looking at here. What's this?
This is my diary from 1975, and I wrote in it every single night.
I wondered if you could read me the entries for September 4th.
As from last night at 11:30, I cannot write as I wish to. Lynn, my one and only true friend, was brutally attacked and raped. There was little idea of the person or people who did this. Lynn has been in West Middlesex Hospital since Wednesday and is critically ill with severe brain damage. I know myself, so deep down she will die. She'll die, but I cannot accept it. Lynn means so much to me. I love her more than anyone. Oh, sorry, that's... Lynn, she was a very brainy girl. She was very good at the languages, especially French and German, so she was going to go to college and then become a bilingual secretary. Looking back, it's quite a few years, but she had a little sort of a wicked sense of humour even then. But I did love Lynn, and she loved me. We just got on so well. She was a great girl, an absolute great girl.
Do you remember this September the 3rd, 1975? From what I've read, Lynn came to your house by bus. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that?
I would imagine we'd probably have got ready, done our hair a bit, maybe some makeup. As I can remember, we got the bus back, and then we met at the Elm Tree pub with the boys, and then just being in the pub. I can remember sometimes Lynn and I would go there, and we'd have no money, but the boys would rally around and buy us half a pint of whatever, and that would just last us all night. We weren't getting drunk or anything. We would just meet up and just sit there and chat and have good fun. Maybe probably a game of pool or something.
You spent a couple of hours in the pub.
It was just like a normal night. Nothing different happened that night. And I remember when we left, it was just that usual, bye, speak to you tomorrow, or see you tomorrow. Lynn went her way with the boys. Then I got the bus to come home, and then the next morning I had my mum coming up to my bedroom to see if Lynn was with me. And I said, no, she didn't stay. Why? What's happened? And she said, oh, Lynn's mum's on the phone. Lynn didn't go home last night.
What had happened to Lynn?
She got attacked very brutally over her head. And then raped. And then when she was found, her pants were down her throat.
I didn't know that.
I remember going up to the hospital to see her, and Lynn was in a coma. That was the last time I saw her alive, until we got the news that she'd passed away. To lose your special friend, I've never had a special friend since. I'm sorry, I can't stop the tears now. Why Lynn? Did he mean to? Was it just a random attack? Did he know Lynn? Did I know Lynn? Did I know him? Did any of us know him?
Talking to Rosemary, the main thing that you feel is how more than 40 years after Lynn Whedon's death, she's carrying so much pain about the death of her best friend. I'd always thought of the Lynn Whedon attack as an anomaly, but then hearing that detail about the panties makes me think this was a sexual predator, perhaps of precisely the kind who killed Eve Stratford.
I see you are still having no luck catching me. You are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
The voice of the man the police believe is the Yorkshire Ripper, taunting them with their failure to catch him. The Ripper has butchered and mutilated 12 women. The Yorkshire Ripper doesn't know his victims. All he asks is that they are women and they are alone.
I think he will kill again, and possibly again and again.
Peter Sutcliffe, known as the Yorkshire Ripper, was one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. Between 1975 and 1981, he terrorised communities in the north of England, often carrying a hammer to attack lone women. As I looked into the murders of Eve Stratford and Lynn Whedon, I discovered that many people had come to wonder if Peter Sutcliffe was the killer. One ex-Bunny girl had even contacted the police to tell them of her suspicions. It seemed an outlandish theory, but it turned out that it had been put forward by a former police intelligence officer in a book. I remember Peter Sutcliffe from my childhood as the Yorkshire Ripper. He was this terrifying figure who murdered women in the late 1970s, but in Yorkshire. So how can he possibly be connected to a series of murders that happened in London?
There were so many unsolved murders of unaccompanied women in the 1970s, and I condensed them, and I looked at Peter Sutcliffe, and he seemed to be the common denominator.
How many more murders do you think he ought to be considered in relation to?
My research has found 40. That
40?
includes, yes, that includes murders and attacks.
This is a shockingly high number, way more than the 13 murders and 7 attempted murders that Sutcliffe was found guilty of.
In the last 4 years, a succession of bodies have been brought into the mortuaries. 4 in Leeds, 3 in Bradford, 2 in Halifax, 2 in Manchester, 1 in Preston. And as the murders continued, the clamour to call in Scotland Yard also grew.
In 1975 is when Lynn Whedon is attacked.
Yeah.
And what is it about the attack on Lynn that bears the hallmarks of a Yorkshire Ripper attack?
The blunt force instrument to the back of the head, which smashed Lynn's skull, which Peter Sutcliffe used on a couple of occasions within the same timeline. Basically, in early August, Olive Smelt left a pub in Halifax. Sutcliffe followed her down a snicket and bashed her on the back of the head.
But the crucial thing is, Lynn Whedon was hundreds of miles south from where those prior attacks took place.
Well, Sonia, his future wife, had an older sister who lived in Alperton near Wembley. This was early September. Peter Sutcliffe and Sonia travelled down to Alperton. Eventually, they all flew off from Heathrow to go to Czechoslovakia and other Eastern European countries. This was the same week as Lynn's attack in West London.
Just to be clear, so you're saying that in the week of Lynn Whedon's death, the Yorkshire Ripper is in London 6 miles away from where Lynn Whedon is murdered?
Yes.
But what about the Eve Stratford murder? Do you think that Peter Sutcliffe is a plausible suspect for the murder of Eve?
Well, on the 22nd of March, Sonia's sister living in Alperton was getting married in the Wembley area. The family would have come down from Bradford in preparation and staying at the location because, you know, you're talking about 200 or 300 miles travel by road.
And 4 days earlier, Eve Stratford is murdered in Leighton. And in the MO of the Eve Stratford murder, which involved rape and a knife attack, that Eve had her throat cut, were those Are those acts that could plausibly have been committed by Peter Sutcliffe?
In the acknowledged Yorkshire Ripper series, you have Emily Jackson and Irene Richardson both had their throats slashed, as well as other mutilation.
There's a link between Eve Stratford and Lynn Whedon that we know from the DNA that was gathered. Then presumably he would have been ruled out using his DNA.
This is a freedom of information request. I asked whether a sample of Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper, has been obtained and is searchable in the National DNA Database. And the Home Office came back and said a DNA sample for Peter Sutcliffe was obtained and is currently held and searchable in the National DNA Database. They did a buccal mouth swab, which they'd done for all life prisoners, but Sutcliffe was a non-secretor. So although you leave a DNA sample with fingerprint or whatever because of the moisture, in a case of a non-secretor, although there's a barcode there, it doesn't actually go back to anyone unless you take blood from the suspect.
Sutcliffe was an evil predator, but blaming him for Lynn and Eve's murders somehow bothers me. It's too neat. Everything that seems to connect him to the crimes is pure supposition. Chris Clark claims that because Sutcliffe's blood type didn't show up in his semen or saliva, he can't be ruled out as the killer through DNA. But how true is this? I needed to talk to an expert. One of the reasons I wanted to get in touch was I was speaking to a former policeman. His argument is that as the Yorkshire Ripper was a non-secretor, there would have been no usable evidence to connect him to the crime scenes. Does it make any difference if the person is a secretor or a non-secretor in terms of getting DNA?
Absolutely no difference at all. It doesn't influence what we look at when we match somebody on a DNA profile. It's a completely different area of the DNA molecule that we're looking at. And whether somebody has the secretor gene or not isn't going to make any difference.
Professor Syndicum Court has helped me understand that being a non-secretor has no bearing on the quality of the DNA evidence. We know Peter Sutcliffe's DNA is on the national database, as is the DNA of Eve and Lynn's killer. If there was a match, the police computer would have made it. And since it wasn't Sutcliffe, who was it? I've come to question the apparent link between the murders of the ex-Bunny girl Eve Stratford and the West End croupier Linda Farrow. Despite certain similarities, there are key differences that suggest they were not killed by the same man. And yet Eve Stratford's murder was connected by DNA to another unsolved crime, the rape and murder of 16-year-old Lynn Whedon in 1975. And I was about to learn of another potential victim.
The 12:20 from Hammersmith pulled into Osterley Tube Station. Elizabeth Paravicini had been to see Casanova at a West End cinema with friends. She left the station alone. Elizabeth Paravicini was slim, blonde, and very attractive. She was half a mile from her parents' home, a walk that normally took her about 10 minutes. She set off along the Great West Road, a busy, well-lit dual carriageway. After 100 yards, she turned into leafy suburban Thornbury Road, into Church Road, and finally into Osterley Road, where her parents live. It was now nearly midnight. It was dark, and the roads were empty. She was a girl of impeccable background, walking through a respectable, middle-class part of town. She was alone, or so she thought.
This is the murder scene, the sad murder scene of Elizabeth Paravicini, and she was struck over the head with a blunt object, believed to be metallic, and it is thought that the suspect actually threw her over the wall to carry out his offences. And what happened is her dad, George, the next morning, retraced her steps, and it was in fact he that found his own daughter murdered.
Police have combed the shrubbery. The whole area has been searched and searched again. But still, 7 days after, no trace of the murder weapon or the murderer has been found. Police are intrigued by the fact that this murder was almost a carbon copy of another brutal murder which took place in the same area just 2 years ago. On September the 4th, 1975, a 16-year-old student, Lynn Whedon, was attacked and raped 50 yards from her home. And the two murders took place within a mile of each other.
What did you think of the investigation into the murder of Elizabeth Paravicini?
Chris Draycott, the Detective Chief Superintendent in charge of the quarry, actually linked the two. As a detective, I look at those two, it's virtually identical, the MO. They were both attacked from behind and both attacked with a blunt instrument.
Lynn Whedon was raped. Was Elizabeth Paravicini?
No, she wasn't raped. I think that was certainly the intention. I remember from looking through the case papers that it would appear that he had problems removing her lower clothing.
If Eve Stratford is DNA linked to Lynn Whedon, and the MO of Lynn Whedon and Elizabeth Paravicini is so similar, then we're looking at an individual who's responsible for all these murders.
Very much so, yes.
What sort of picture do you personally have of the murderer? What sort of person are you looking for?
To my mind, I'm looking for a brutal, callous killer who could well strike again.
Now, it was a particularly brutal attack, wasn't it?
It was.
Might he have been disturbed, do you think?
After the initial shock of seeing the links between these two unsolved murders, what strikes you about the case file?
I mean, when I picked it up, it was many, many years later, is to assess any possible lines of inquiry. So I decided that I was going to read all the witness depositions. And halfway through this huge bundle, as I found a statement from my best friend, who hitherto had been on the original inquiry.
So you're saying your friend was at the heart of both of the original investigations, gathering evidence?
Yeah, really the right person on the ground to be able to get a detailed overview as to what I had in front of me. My colleague, who had been a detective sergeant, revealed to me who he thought was responsible. This particular individual entered the police service in the 80s, was someone that I'd served with at a police station, and someone that I knew reasonably well. This was a serving Metropolitan Police officer.
Wow. That's a bombshell. We'll call this man Policeman B. How did his name come into the picture?
In the early 1980s, this man was convicted of serious indecent assault, sexually motivated burglaries and theft. So all of this were ringing serious alarm bells.
How far did this person live at the time from the sites of the Paravicini and Lynn Whedon murders?
Very close. He would have been able to walk to both sites within about half an hour from his home address.
Was he looked at in the original investigations of Lynn Whedon and Elizabeth Paravicini?
I can't recall him being a suspect.
The fellow we're talking about clearly left a bad impression on you and your former colleagues, but there's no evidence that suggests he's a murderer.
No. The trouble is, unless you've got some more compelling evidence, you've got nothing.
Policeman B had been routinely questioned in 1977 in relation to the murder of Elizabeth Paravicini and ruled out. Police at the time took the unusual step of publicly stating that he was never considered a suspect in this case or that of Lynn Whedon. They cleared him conclusively of any involvement in both cases. But my research into these murders showed that this man had been found guilty of a shocking but unrelated crime. It started with an investigation into a seemingly trivial theft, but revealed him to be a sexual predator. Simon Addy was the man who first arrested him.
In 1982, I was a detective sergeant at Brentford Police Station in charge of the small CID office there. The telephone rang, and it was a woman who said she was the headmistress of the Green School for Girls. At this school, the sixth form girls have a common room, and they all clubbed together and bought what was then a very expensive radio cassette player. And this had gone missing. And one of the girls told her later that a policeman had been seen leaving the school premises carrying a radio cassette player. She told me what his name was and that he was welcome on the premises because he was helping the girls with their skiing techniques. I decided I would have to go and knock on his door because there could be an innocent explanation, but, you know, being a detective, you always think the worst about people, so... I told him what the allegation was. He said, it's my radio cassette player. So, go upstairs to his bedroom, he hands me the radio cassette player, and it is the same radio cassette player that was stolen from the Green School for Girls. So I arrested him, cautioned him, and then told him I would be searching his room. We first of all found a police radio, which at the time only covered police station area you would be in. As it turned out, he had taken this radio from Brentford police station, so it would cover Chiswick and Brentford area, the area in which he lived.
The PC we're talking about worked out of Kensington Police
Correct.
Station. What was your reaction when you were seeing
Well, I said,
these
why have you got this police radio here? And he said, I borrowed it. So we continued the search, and then, most interestingly, I found a police inspector's tunic with 2 pips on each shoulder.
Policeman B was only a constable. There was no reason for him to have the uniform of a senior officer. Well, why would anyone want to have a police inspector's uniform?
I did wonder whether he was putting this uniform on at night with the police radio, sort of prowling around, seeing who he could come across.
Whatever his motive for having these items, Policeman B had perpetrated terrible crimes. A young policeman who wore a black mask and brandished a terrible knife during a savage sex attack on a 34-year-old Hanworth housewife. The attacker put his arm around the woman's neck and held a 12-inch knife at her throat. He threatened to kill her, forced her to lie on the ground, removed her clothing, and indecently assaulted her. The woman, who broke down and wept as she gave evidence, said, "I kept saying, 'Please do not hurt me. Put the knife away and I'll do anything that you like.'" The victim of his crime worked in a West End nightclub, and that's how he came across her. He put her license plate into a police computer and used that to find her address. And he was also sneaking into the bedrooms of schoolgirls and stealing their underwear. And then he would subsequently call them up and terrorize them over the phone, telling them that he'd moved their underwear around. He got sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. That seems an astonishingly short sentence for such a serious crime. Today, the Metropolitan Police is reeling from a series of scandals that have destroyed the public's trust in it.
Sarah Everard was, the judge said, simply walking home.
Wayne Couzens, a policeman, also a kidnapper, rapist and murderer.
For the 2 decades David Carrick wore a police uniform, he was attacking and abusing women when he was off duty.
Policeman B's offending shows that the Met's problem with serving police officers carrying out sexual offences and preying on women is nothing new. A man who was supposed to protect the vulnerable was exploiting his position to abuse them. If there's one thing that's more terrifying than the idea of a predator, it's a predator in a policeman's uniform. I feel like I've taken this about as far as I can go on my own. I've still got so many unanswered questions that I think probably only the police are able to answer. So I'm going to write to the Met. I really want to know if these 4 murders are definitively linked by them, if they are investigating them together. I really want to know about the strength of the DNA link between Eve Stratford and Lynn Whedon because so many aspects of the two crimes seem anomalous. As I was writing to the Met, my producer, Mel, finally tracked down the man who Gladys Hayes always suspected of being involved in her daughter Linda's murder. The man who I've called Policeman A was cleared in 1979, many years after leaving the force, of any involvement in the crime. Mel spoke to him on the phone, and he agreed we could use the recording.
You knew Linda and Paul, you worked in casinos.
Let's go easy on the names. I'm a long way removed from that world. Basically, a lot of us are trying to make as much bloody money as we could before someone closed them all down. Oh, okay, there were a number of casinos that had contacts with the underworld. Ours was not.
And for the record, Linda and Paul weren't mixed up in any underworld stuff, if you like.
Not the two people I knew. She would understand that if you push these bastards too far, they'd come back. No, that doesn't add up at all. If they were bloody good at hiding.
Police have spoken to you before. Tell me a little bit about what's happened with that.
You've got away with awkward questions, girl. When the police first came to me, they mentioned Linda. I didn't realise at that stage that Linda was dead. It never made much news, as far as I remember.
And did they tell you why your name had cropped up, or was it a kind of blanket?
No. If they did, I can't remember it. I was certainly not very happy about it all. Because one, I knew I had done nothing wrong. I knew I hadn't hurt anybody, I hadn't killed anybody, I hadn't robbed a bank, I'd done nothing wrong.
Policeman A said that Linda's death was as much of a mystery to him as it was to us. But then there was a development. This man revealed to Mel that the Met was sending 2 detectives to the Far East to speak to him.
All I know is they want to see me, they want to talk to me, I suppose. I've never killed anybody in life. I've never even violently assaulted people. I think 1 or 2 are right for done, but no, I didn't.
A couple of months later, Mel spoke to Policeman A again. He confirmed that detectives had been to his home, interviewed him, and taken his DNA and fingerprints. Policeman A told us that according to the detectives he'd spoken to, he is not a suspect in the murder of Linda Farrow, and he'd been cleared of any involvement in the case. I don't know why detectives went to talk to this man, but I did receive a response from the Met in which they confirmed that he'd been eliminated from their inquiries and divulged some other significant new information. I shared it with someone who'd helped me on my journey and had a lot of experience dealing with police bureaucracy. I've sent you a copy of the letter I got from the Met. So the fact that they engaged with this to this extent is significant.
Yeah, because they're clearly recognising that what's being done has been serious and with a serious intent.
This is what the Met said in response to my questions. That Detective Chief Inspector Jeff Grogan of the Specialist Crime Command is leading the investigation into the murders of Eve Stratford in Leighton and Lynn Whedon in Hounslow in 1975. As this is a live investigation, it would be inappropriate to provide a running commentary, and the Met does not identify any person who may or may not be subject to an investigation. And I suppose that was what heartened me about the Met response, is that they say that this is a live investigation.
Yeah. Well, they're still actively considering leads, that they're still trying to trace, interview, and eliminate people who might be of interest to their investigation.
To date, how many DNA tests have now been done on the Weed and Stratford cases? To date, we have obtained more than 200 voluntary samples and work continues.
200 is a significant number. So that's the piece of new information that's in the public domain.
Then this was the kind of key one for me. I wanted to know if the murders of Linda Farrow, Eve Stratford, Lynn Whedon and Elizabeth Paravicini are linked. They say Lynn and Eve are linked. There is no evidence to link the murders of Eve and Lynn to any other historic murder case, but we retain an open mind. We are aware of reporting around Linda Farrow in particular, and while there are some similarities with Eve's case, there is no evidence to link them at this time. Instead of a single serial killer who was committing horrific crimes, it seems like there were multiple men capable of homicides against women.
And getting away with it. So that's 3 perpetrators that have frankly got away with it. And that for me was pretty depressing, but nonetheless real. What are you going to take away from what you've discovered?
Well, I never felt that I would solve it on my own, but I thought there were still enough people alive who might remember things, who might remember names, who might have key pieces of evidence, who might shine a light in a certain direction, that through that, I might scare up something that would move the story along. And I think that's still the case. I think this even going out, people watching it, might scare up more information.
And that's a good ending, isn't it? If we shone a light onto a case that needed some attention.
As I came towards the end of my investigation, I got some sad news from Amsterdam. Eve Stratford's former boyfriend, Tony Priest, who'd been ill for a long time, had decided to end his own life with voluntary euthanasia. He never lived to see Eve's killer face justice. It's been a very sad journey, actually, and I think I embarked on it with kind of intellectual curiosity and a fascination for returning to the London of my childhood, and I was excited about the idea of solving a mystery that had lasted decades. But I've also encountered people whose lives have been irreparably damaged by grief and loss. When I think of Tony, or Rosemary, or Eve's fellow bunnies, you realize there are multiple tragedies, and the ripples from these murders go out for decades. So this is the grave of Eve Stratford, who died in 1975. And the striking thing about this is that there's no headstone. And it's a really dark footnote to this story that after she was buried in 1975, vandals continually desecrated her grave, and they broke her headstone and they defaced it. It's really upsetting, actually, that after her parents lost their daughter, they had to put up with the repeated vandalism of her grave, and her mum got telephone calls telling her she was going to be next. I mean, it's baffling. It's as baffling as anything in this story. I suppose that there was still that misogyny that in her life, Eve was presented herself as an object of desire, but she was also an object of male hatred and fear. And that continued after her death, that people objected to her either being a bunny girl or appearing in Mayfair magazine. And it's really sick, actually, and pointless. It reminds you that women in this story were women who men were attracted to, but who men also wanted to destroy. Sadly, without forensic evidence, identifying the men who murdered Linda Farrow and Elizabeth Paravicini will be difficult. But I remain hopeful that Eve and Lynn's killer will eventually be brought to justice. When you think about it, Eve was laid to rest in 1975. 31 years later, DNA yields a breakthrough in the case that links it to the murder of Lynn Whedon. I can't help thinking that someone knows something, and science will yield a clue, and the DNA is out there, and one of these days we'll know more about this case than we do now.
Over on ITVX, there's the shocking case of the footballer fraudster, available now. And back this weekend, a fresh group of famous faces leave luxury behind, all for our enjoyment. It's I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, Sunday at 9.